Hi. So friends, what comes to your mind when you look at a flower? The beauty of the flower, the fragrance of the flower fascinates all of us. Now, when we come down to the parts of the flower has got the outermost whorl which you could see very well. It is green in color and we call it sepals. Sepals protect the flower when the flower is in bud condition. Next comes the petals which are colorful. The petals, the colorful part of the flower is known as petals. These petals attract the insects for pollination. Now the next word is you could see the yellow part over here. These are the stamens. Stamens are the male part of the flower, and then there comes the inner part of the flower which is known as the pistil. Pistil is the female part of the flower. Now when we talk about the green color part of the flower, the sepals, all together we call it as a calyx. So calyx is the outermost whorl of the flower which is known as sepals. This is the green part of the flower which protects the flower in bud condition. The next colorful part of the flower, what we talked about, the petals, it is together known as corolla. So calyx, corolla, and then comes the stamens, together we call it as androecium, and then comes the female part of the flower which is known as gynoecium. So flower together is divided into four parts: calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. Moving down to further to the parts of the flower, here you all could see we have stamens as the male part of the flower and pistil as female part of the flower. So moving on to stamens, stamens are further divided into two parts. One is anther, which you could see the yellow part over here, and then you have a stalk-like structure known as filament. So male part of the flower or stamen of the flower is divided into two parts, anther and filament. Moving on to the female part of the flower, which is divided into three parts actually. You could very well see the female part of the flower. It looks like a flask. So it is a flask type structure and it's divided into stigma. The topmost part is the stigma. Then comes a long tube-like structure which is known as style. Then comes the ovary. So stigma, style and ovary are the three parts of the female part of the flower, and then inside the ovary are the ovules. If you see ovary carefully, it is the swollen part of the flower. Stigma is lobe-like. Style is like a very long tubular organ, and then when it comes to ovary is the swollen part. When you look at the style is thin tube like which connects stigma to the ovary. Now when we see the ovary as a whole, which is divided into three parts, the stigma, style and ovary, we call it as pistil. Now if you see over here, the pistil, when it comes to the male part of the flower, the stamen of the flower, we can see over here, the stamen has got three parts, stamen has got two parts, that is anther and filament. Now in this flower you can see both the things, the pistil and the stamen. Pistil divided into stigma, style and ovary, whereas stamen has got two parts, anther and the filament, the stalk-like filament. This flower, if you see as a whole, it has got both the sexual organs, the male as well as the female. When it has got both the sexual organs, we call it as bisexual. Bisexual means a flower which has got both male and female parts. So we call it as a complete flower or a perfect flower. Now moving on to this kind of flower, if you see carefully, look at this flower, it has got only female part of the flower, it has got only pistil, whereas the male part of the flower, stamens are not there. Now look at another flower. over here there is no pistil, you could only see the stamens. So in both the flowers, if you'll see, only one sexual organ is present. This is the male flower, whereas this is the female flower, and we call, since only one sexual organ is present, we call it as a unisexual flower. So we have two types of flowers, bisexual flower and the unisexual flower. Now if we see carefully, the unisexual, now we call it as an imperfect flower also. Now look at this flower carefully. These are the anthers. We'll see how pollen is transferred or moves on from anther to the stigma. You can see the pollen falling over here. Yes, this is how it moves. Now look at it carefully. The pollen has fallen from the anther to the stigma, and then this pollen has generated, the moment it falls over here, it generates a tube-like structure. This tube travels down through the style and it reaches the ovary, it penetrates the ovary and it comes over here. Now, the moment it comes over here, this male gamete, this pollen, which fell on the stigma and then traveled down the style, moved to the ovary and penetrates the ovary wall. This male gamete fuses with the female gamete over here in the ovary and it forms a zygote. Now, what exactly this, the moment it fuses with the female gamete here, this process is known as fertilization. So now what is fertilization all about? It is just the fusion of the male and female gamete. Whereas what is pollination? When pollen falls from the anther to the stigma, when the pollen is transferred, or the process by which the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma, this process is known as pollination. So I'm sure you are clear about the terms pollination and fertilization. Now what exactly happens after fertilization? Once the fertilization takes place, you will see that gradually, now look at this flower carefully. You cannot see the petals around here. Once the fertilization takes place, once the zygote is formed, once the male and female gametes fuses and makes an embryo, what exactly happens here is these sepals also will gradually dry and fall. Petals dry and fall. The stamens, what you could see around here, also dries and falls. Moreover, stigma and style also will dry and fall. What you are going to see on the plant is just the ovary. This ovary swells up, it ripens and it gets converted into fruit. Now think about mango. Once this ovary is converted into fruit, this is the wall of the ovary. The mango that you eat is the skin of the mango is the skin of the ovary. The mango that you eat, the pulp that you eat, is actually the ovary of a flower. These ovules gets converted into seed. The seed of the mango is the ovule, and few ovules make the endosperm inside the seed. So once the seed is formed, once the fruit is formed, you enjoy the fruit, but you actually eat the ovary of a flower. On any plant, you will find the flowers blooming first and then only you will get the fruit. The reason is, once the fertilization is done, as soon as the fertilization is done, the sepals and petals dries and fall, stamen and stigma, style, everything dries and fall. This is the ripened ovary of the flower that you eat and enjoy as a fruit. Now, when it comes to pollination, here we have two types of pollination. I'll be coming down to that. We have right now you could see the seeds formed, okay, and which will give whereas you can get a new plant out of it. Now we have two types of pollination. One is self-pollination and the one is cross-pollination. Self-pollination, as you all have seen, the pollen falls from the anther to the stigma of the, here the pollen falls in the same flower. You could see how close by it is. The stamens, you could see they are very close to the female part of the flower. The pollen falls on the stigma very easily since they are very close by, and the wastage of pollen also will not be there. Much of the pollen will not get wasted. Fertilization is the pollination is done quickly. Even the fertilization takes place quickly over here when we come down to the self-pollination. It is self-pollinated or autogamy. Now let's come down to the cross-pollination. What exactly happens in the cross-pollination? The pollen from one flower falls on the stigma of the another flower, either of the same plant or of another plant of the same kind of flower. So this is known as cross-pollination. This cross-pollination needs some agents. You might have seen a bee sitting on one flower and moving on to another flower, or imagine if a butterfly comes and sits on this flower, what exactly will happen? The pollen will stick on the body of the butterfly. When the same butterfly goes and sits on another flower, it drops the pollen on the stigma of the flower. And once the pollen is dropped there, it generates a tube and it travels down to the ovary, and then the fertilization takes place over here. So here bee, or you could say the butterfly, acts as an agent of pollination. They help in transferring the pollen from one flower to another. Some flowers you will find where they are not that colorful. So in such flowers, even wind act as a agent of pollination, whereas it is very thin and could be easily blown away by the wind. So through wind also it is transferred and the pollination is done. Whereas in some cases it is also done with the help of the water. The pollen is transferred with the water and the fertilization takes place, pollination takes place. So this is all about self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is very easy. Cross-pollination needs some agents in order to transfer the pollen from one flower to another. Even grazing animals, the cow and buffalo, when they keep grazing, they transfer pollen from one flower to another flower while grazing. Now moving on, I would like to summarize the thing. Over here we talked about the flower. Whereas we had a unisexual flower, we had a bisexual flower. Unisexual flower, the flower having only one sex organ, could be a male or a female. Such flower we call as an incomplete flower. When we talk about bisexual flower, that is the flower what I showed you, the hibiscus rosa sinensis. It has got both male and female part of the flower, and we are part of the thing, and we call it as a complete flower. So we have incomplete flower and a complete flower. When we talked about the parts of the flower, we talked about calyx, the sepals. The whorl of the sepals is known as calyx altogether, which were green in color and protect the flower in the bud condition. We moved on to the next whorl of the flower, that is the colorful part of the flower, which are petals. Petals together we call it as corolla. Moving on to the next inner part of the flower, which were the stamens. All together stamens are known as androecium, which is the male part of the flower. And then we moved on to the innermost part of the flower, which is the female part of the flower, or the pistil of the flower, which is divided into stigma, style and ovary. Together we call it as gynoecium. Now, when we also talked about pollination, whereas we discussed about self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Self-pollination usually done in the bisexual flowers only. Cross-pollination could be done in unisexual flower and bisexual flower as well. We ended up with the agents of pollination, that is insects, wind and water. These agents, they help in pollination. They help in transferring the pollen from one flower to the stigma of the another flower. It could be done by insects, it could be done by wind and water as well. I'm sure that you are aware of all the terms what we discussed about. You know pollination, you know fertilization, you know what are the parts of the flower, and we'll discuss in the next class. Thank you so much.